I can't see you
Yeah,
guys.
you're good.
All right, cool. So really the topic of today, we're gonna talk about a couple things, and I want to keep this like pretty informal. So it's a small group. Don't be afraid to just like unmute yourselves, interrupt me. I'm happy to like either clarify things or expand on things further. I tried to keep, not a whole lot in my slides, because I didn't want to, just have word vomit and everything. So just kind of bullet points, and then happy to expand or clarify things if you guys have questions. But really, the goal, main portion of this talk, or the first portion, is going to be talking about third year and how you can really optimize it and set yourself up for success, not just academically, but extracurricularly, or just outside of medicine, outside of ERAS, outside of everything. Just like well generalized well-being and really just some kind of tips from someone who has been through it with unique circumstances, which I'll kind of talk about. So I'm your host. I'm from Steamboat, Colorado. Went to Colby College for undergrad in Maine. I'm a brain injury survivor, first year medical school, was in a really bad car accident. Had to take 2 years off of medical school to recover and get to a point where I felt like I could continue medicine. And for a while, I didn't even know if I was going to be able to, return to medical school. I'm a former Division One athlete. I skied in college. Still love to try and ski when I can. I went to Drexel, as Steph had said. I did my intern year at Lincoln Medical Center just outside of Philly. And now I'm here at Pittsburgh for my rest of my PMR rotation. So if any of you guys have want to touch on third year study strategies and leading up to step two, I want to provide a little bit of research behind that and why I think it's beneficial. Also, step three, question mark. I think, some of the feedback or some of the things I wish I did is fourth year is fun, great for a ways. But you got a lot of free time, and intern year is really busy. So it's not a terrible time to study and take step three, maybe, if that's in the cards for you. Um, I'm going to talk about my philosophy or away rotations, talk about personal statement, talk about the interview process, and some kind of tips around that. So, goals for third year. I think if you take anything away from this, whether it's anything I say or just a further analysis of how you want or year three to go, I think it should be that you should set yourself up to be as competitive as possible while learning and growing as a student. I think that's, first and foremost, and that's kind of broken down into the knowledge, the self exams, research, and kind of trying to make yourself competitive. Volunteering is huge. I think it's an area that's totally underrated, and there's so many amazing opportunities to do some volunteering related to PM&R. I myself raised a seeing eye dog, so you might not think that that's necessarily related to PM&R specifically, but we raised a dog from 5 weeks old to a year and a half, trained it, base had to teach it how to pee and poop on command, a bunch of other stuff. And then the dog goes, gets its formal training and goes and helps someone navigate the world who, can't see. And so you're providing a huge level of function that this person didn't have before. And I was able to talk about that a lot on my interview trail. So I think you just can be creative with some of these volunteer experiences and link them in your own special way to the rehab realm if that's what you're trying to do. It's also the other kind of more academic side is performing well in your rotations, getting those letters of recommendation, avoiding red and yellow flags is the big one. You just don't want any of that on your application, and sometimes you're tired, you're burnt out, and you either just don't feel like showing up or do something silly, and sometimes uh, we just want to avoid those if possible, and then overarching all of this is managing your stress and anxiety because it's kind of anxious if you're Drexel and you're rotator, you gotta pretty much be in a new location every 5 to 10 weeks or 4 to 8 weeks depending on how Drexel set it up. I'm sure for anyone else who's at other institutions, if you do rotate, it's kind of a similar vibe as well. So my philosophy for third year, I don't, I did not want to look back on match day and think I could have worked harder at third year. third year, I think, is a really defining moment because you're finally in the clinical realm. You're finally doing doctor stuff. You're really, trying to get your foot in the hospital. You're now like actually learning how to apply all the knowledge you learned your first 2 years of school or first year and a half of school or whatever it is by the time you kind of enter that clinical realm. And so it can be, very frightening, very exciting. But I kind of went about it in a lens. I'll start by saying I had the brain injury. I could not study for my first years more than 3 hours a day. And by the end of the day, I was totally wiped, couldn't do anything, was just useless. And there was a lot of anxiety for me going into third year, thinking, how am I going to do this? How am I going to both study and show up for my rotations? And so what I decided to do, and again, I look back on this, I highly recommend it to anyone, is flip your schedule. So consider waking up early before your rotations and studying prior to your rotations. So for me, usually that was waking up about 5 a.m., studying for anywhere from an hour to sometimes if it's an outpatient rotation, even up to 2 hours. And sometimes I'd wake up maybe a little bit later. But usually I dedicated at least an hour and a half to studying each day. Um, and what that did is for those of you who have already done third year rotations, for your fourth years, I'm sure you can relate to this, that extra kind of downtime during the day where if you hadn't yet, if you were an afternoon or evening study, you're like, ooh, I can kind of bust all of this studying out, get my studying done for the day, and then I'm done. That was all extra time to study. So instead of maybe I had budgeted an hour and a half of studying or an hour of studying in a day, all of a sudden I was getting 2 hours or 2.5 hours, and I was able to stay actually ahead of my planned schedule. And to the next kind of area there is it allowed me to stay up to date with some of the previous rotation information. And I think this is really key when you look at it in the realm of step two at the end of your third year. And that I tutored a lot of people who their biggest regret was like, oh, I wish I had kept up with the information. And I'll be the first to say it's hard. I'm not saying, oh, it's easy, you can keep up with it. Like it definitely takes some effort, but I'll kind of allude to some tips in terms of how to maybe ensure that you're trying to at least keep up with a portion of the information. And whether or not it's 100% or 50% or even 25% retention from what you had learned in that previous block, it's still going to set you up so much better for step two when it comes to your dedicated period. So, how I liked or how I ultimately set up my study schedule is I took 15 to 30 minutes, sometimes maybe a little bit longer if I'd taken a little bit of time off. But I did that first thing. I'm a big Anki user, so it was purely just, unsuspending, or I actually had, instead of suspending stuff, I didn't like doing that. I like created separate silos for psych, IM, things like that. I just went back and did those Anki cards, tried to keep up to date with them. Eventually was able to get it down to so few cards that it really truly was 15 to 30 minutes. And if you kind of have been doing Anki the whole time, you're able to kind of just roll over. Say you just finished IM, you start your new rotation, you can just kind of keep up with things and it's actually okay. That being said, I understand Anki's kind of a hot topic. A lot of people don't like it. So whatever study strategy worked for you in terms of, was it practice questions? Was it your own flashcards? You rolled flashcards, whatever it was, stick to that and try and spend that first 15 or 30 minutes of that day studying, because it's so easy to just get what you need to get done, study for, say you wanted to do 20 UWorld questions, and then you're kind of beat, and you're like, oh, like I don't really want to study stuff from my previous shelf for other information. I'm just going to push it off till tomorrow. And so that just kind of gets pushed and pushed and pushed down the road. And all of a sudden, what was maybe a tennis ball size of information is now this giant boulder of stuff you've forgotten that is now going to slam into you when you finish your final rotation and are starting to study for step two. So just anything you can do during the year, even if it's 15 to 30 minutes a day, is really going to help with that retention and help with that long-term studying. And there's a lot of overlap between shelves. So, what you maybe done in your neurology shelf, some of that is going to be reflected in your internal medicine shelf. The surgery shelf, very heavy in the medical management of surgical patients as well. And so there's a lot of carryover there that can be really beneficial. And then another thing I want to talk on, which I have a whole slide I'm going to talk about in a second, is this idea of weakness training. We hate talking about or working on our weaknesses, and so this is something I want to I can't stress enough that can be really beneficial. And I think you'll see gains as you move through third year into fourth year. It kind of reflects into your away rotations. It can be really helpful with that. And then finally, a theme that I maybe have already touched on, but I think just consistency. You got to stick with it. You can adjust it if necessary. It's a long year. You're going to be burnt out at some point. I hope you're not, but likely you are. But again, it's only a year. So, do what you can to sacrifice now because, ultimately it can pay dividends and it can make you feel that much more confident going into fourth year, getting a good step two score because ultimately that's, on the back of a lot of people's mind. And, yes, scores have started to become de-emphasized. But if you get a good score, you're going to hear about it. And, I will say I had a very, very good step two score, and it came up probably on maybe 40 to 50% of my interviews that it was commented on. So if you can get a good score, it's great. Just because you don't have a good score doesn't mean you're not going to go to a good program. You still have, who you are as an applicant. And, sometimes in a lot of people's minds, if you're able to stand out in other areas, then a great score doesn't necessarily make or break it. But it's always, beneficial to have the score that you feel, really good about and proud of. So that's just kind of my tidbit on that there. And then the last piece is schedule your vacations. And I don't mean schedule your, 1 week go to Cabo or something like that. I I mean vacations in terms of your day to day. So one thing I loved about flipping my schedule is when I was done with clinic or done from my surgery rotation or done for my internal medicine rotation, I was done. So that left me the entire afternoon, sometimes 2 p.m., sometimes from 6 p.m. on, to cook dinner, to do research, to volunteer, to just totally decompress, watch a movie. I learned how to play golf my third year, just purely in the afternoons because I had, put in that effort early and study. Because I think anyone who's done some third year rotations can kind of comment on by the end of the day, you're pretty beat and you don't really want to do this anymore. You don't want to sit down and go home and study. Like other people might be going out and doing something, and it can be kind of difficult to motivate yourself to study the way you want to study. So that's what made this kind of schedule so advantageous. Is it really allowed me to work on things that would both help me in ERAS for third and fourth year. It helps me keep my sanity and enjoy the wellness and go do what I wanted to do. And it allowed me to keep studying. And if I felt up for studying in the afternoon, had some stuff I wanted to review, I went and reviewed it. So I touched briefly on the weakness training. I think this is important. If you're not an Anki user, if you don't care about waking up at 5 in the morning, that's great. Ignore everything I just talked to you about. But I think this is really important. And I don't think as medical students entering third year, we do it enough. We maybe do it with our clinical skills, like practicing our H&Ps and practicing presenting a patient, but we don't, I think it often gets kind of neglected when it comes back to, our shelf exams. And I think it's so easy to like say, oh, I hate cardiopulmonary physiology. Like it sucks. I'm just never going to learn. I'm just going to take the L. And that's okay. There's 320 questions on step 2. You can get, 100 wrong and still be just fine. But I think if you can learn that information, that's just opportunities to get those questions right. It's opportunities to better understand your patients when you're rounding in the hospitals. And so it can be really beneficial if you actually take the time, some dedicated time to focus on that. And what I can't stress enough is pick topics based on objective data. The amount of times where I'm like, oh, dear God, I cannot stand learning about the pancreas or pancreatic related conditions or autoimmune hepatitis or any of that. I can't stand it. Like, that's a weakness. Let me study that. But then I actually looked at the questions that I was getting on those, and I was getting them all right. Whereas I was getting a lot of renal questions wrong, which I thought I like really understood the kidney and maybe adrenal insufficiency and things like that. I thought I understood those topics, but I was getting those questions wrong. So there was this disconnect between what I thought I knew and how I was applying that knowledge. And that's what these using objective data can help clarify. A lot of times there is, oh, I hate this topic, you do poorly on it. But a lot of times there isn't that disconnect. So it'd be really important to kind of highlight that. And the best way to use it is you look at your USMLE, you can break it down, or like any practice USMLEs you took. You can look at AMBOSS, look at UWorld, it breaks it down by subject and everything, and you can kind of see this was my weakness. If you're also like, oh, geez, on my shelf for OBGYN, I was 30th percentile or 20th percentile, and all my other ones I'm like 60 or 70th percentile. Like, all right, when I'm trying to focus on trying to remember things as I keep up with the material throughout the year on different rotations, maybe I spend a little bit more time focusing solely on the OBGYN first for that first little bit of my study session, so that I know that I'm getting those reps, learning that information, and better able to integrate that into my knowledge base and then apply it on exams and apply it in the real world situations. For me, weekly training took 30 minutes a day. So I did my 15 to 30 minutes of prepping for like looking at the previous session or previous shelve materials. And then I spent the next 30 minutes doing usually one, sometimes two of the identified weakness areas. For me, that was anywhere from 3 to 5 questions, specifically on topics that I was doing poorly in. I tried to make it as specific as possible. So, I'm okay with it just being cardiology. I took it one step further. I was like, oh, I'm terrible with heart murmurs. Let me just get a bunch of questions in about heart murmurs. And maybe what I did is, if you're an Anki user, what you can do is any questions you're getting wrong, just make an Anki card on it. And then you're doing that during that weakness training, and it's reiterating that information, repeating it over and over again as you go through your cards, day in and day out, and you're going to actually improve on that weakness. So whether it's Anki cards and you do it that way, whether it's flashcards, whether you have a notebook and you're writing down information about that question that you got wrong, whatever it is, find an area where you can just strengthen some of those weaknesses. I promise you it's going to pay dividends. And then, as I mentioned, I did it first thing because I knew that, all right, I just finished an hour and a half of studying surgery. Like, dear God, this is terrible. I don't want to study anymore. I'd rather go watch TV, or, oh, my friends are, out doing X, Y, and Z. I'm just going to go do that. It's easy to just say, I'm not going to do it. But if you did it first thing, then you've done it. You can move on to the stuff that you need to study for that block. And there's a little bit more of that external pressure for you to get that information done than it would be to get stuff that doesn't totally matter in the moment. So some research. I kind of talked to you about my study strategy. This is very brief, but ultimately distributed practice, which is ultimately Anki or flashcards, and practice tests is the most effective learning techniques, whereas rereading, underlining, summarization are the most known techniques, but they're also the least effective ones. And specifically kind of touching in on my spending dedicated time doing X, Y, and Z and kind of lining out how you want your study blocks to go, time management and self-testing are the only two study strategies that showed statistical correlation, significant statistical correlation with academic performance. This was in the first year of med school, but again, I think it totally applies to second, third, fourth year and beyond, just as you continue your practice of medicine. And then something that I think is really important is spaced repetition, which again is what Anki utilizes, especially when combined with retrieval practice, so Anki or questions, is more effective for long-term retention than just either strategy alone. So when you apply both of these, it improves your long-term retention more than just doing one of those strategies alone. And so I think that's, really important. If you can kind of combine as many of these strategies as possible, it's only going to help you with your retention. And then finally, interestingly, with the time, going back to the time management, your ability to kind of gauge out what you need to get done for the day and ensuring that you're being consistent, uh, it was predictive by your time management skills that predicted your test scores. So I thought that is actually pretty interesting. So if you want even more reason, if you don't believe me, here's the research that supports it. So that was a lot of third year rotations. I don't know how many you are PGY1 or sorry, MS1, MS2, how many you are MS3, and how many you are now kind of saying, what the heck? You just talked to me for 20 minutes about something that is in the past and I can't change. Well, now we're going to kind of switch roles, talk a little bit about maybe fourth year subjects, my philosophy about this. And hopefully you can take something away from this. So I'm a huge proponent of away rotations. I did aways at UPMC, at Colorado, Virginia, Utah, all in different subjects within PM. The way I broke that up is UPMC, I did some brain injury, I did some stroke. CU, I did some sports medicine, some spine, and then a large portion of my time was on consults. UVA was all sports medicine, MSK injecting, and then Utah, I did 2 weeks doing spinal cord. So all different stuff. So if you're going to try and do aways, I suggest trying to kind of, spread it out, see what areas may interest you. Really, work hard, do a good job, and hopefully, that'll pay dividends. I say do them, but I think there are some caveats. So if you don't feel comfortable with your physical exam skills, or you don't do well in new situations, then think hard about whether you want to do an away rotation of whether or not that'll be beneficial for you. I'm not saying don't do them, just think about whether or not you are going to be able to display the best version of yourself during that rotation. And if you feel that, hey, I don't know, like I don't feel super confident, then maybe it's something that you decide not to do, and that's totally okay. Um, I think you should really apply early, leverage the contacts you have. I will 100% admit, I did an away at UPMC. The only reason well, maybe not the only reason, but I think one of the major reasons I got that away is I was on a rotation with one of my peers who is on internal medicine. He was like, hey, like, you interested in PM&R? I'm like, yeah, I am. He's like, one of my buddies I did my PhD with is at UPMC. Like, let me text him. So we texted him. Literally 2 days later, get an email back saying, "Hey, like we got your application. We're able to squeeze you in during this time. Maybe not the times you wanted, but we're able to squeeze you in. Does this work with you?" And I was able to make it work. So if there's people that and there's a place you really want to get to, don't it doesn't hurt to reach out. It can only help you. I think if you do it tactfully. Again, no need to like triple text, quadruple email, but be respectful, reach out, leverage your contacts, and they may be able to help you out. And just for context, roughly half of my year at UPMC did aways at Pittsburgh. So 5 of us out of 9 did aways. The year above me was 4 out of 9 did aways. And I think the year below the PGY ones right now, I know 3 or 4 of them did aways as well as Pittsburgh. So, I think probably other programs are pretty similar. The way I like to put it is if you and someone else were the same person on paper, you had the exact same test score, the exact same extracurriculars, the exact same everything, and you did an away there, even if you didn't necessarily do a good job, as long as you didn't do a bad job, someone is a lot more likely to go with the person they know than the person they don't. And so it really, in my mind, gives you a leg up, especially if you can perform well, in terms of having the residents gauge, all right, is this person going to be a good fit for our program? They put a face to the application, you're a known quantity, and you can kind of start that network. So I think, that for me was really big and really helpful. So when you're, thinking about your aways, like keep that in mind and know that like you were interviewing for the program just as much as the program's interviewing you. So it could be a program that you like, "Oh, I want to go here." And if you go and the vibes are just like you're like, like I don't know, this wasn't as great as I thought. Like trust that. Know that like, hey, this isn't necessarily where I want to be. I want to kind of be somewhere else, and I was able to gauge that on some of my away rotations that I talking to some of my peers who applied to PM&R who didn't do away rotations, especially at places that they now matched. They're like, oh, like, yeah, I kind of wish I did an away rotation here. It's like different than my interview day. Um, Not in necessarily a bad way, but just different. And, that can be totally okay, but it can kind of sometimes be surprising. So I also want to touch on personal statements. And I know you guys have probably got a lot of counseling about your personal statements. You probably maybe have already had to submit them by now. But I just want to touch base for those of you who haven't. Just some tidbits. And I also really want to share mine because I felt like the one thing I didn't have was like examples. And everyone of my peers were like, oh, like kind of like hesitant. They didn't really want to share each other's, or like those who did, we weren't going into the same field. And so I would have loved to just see like an example of one. And so looking back, like here's mine. I'm not, bashful. There's a link to it. I'll send this to Steven if it's not clickable right now. And he can share it with you guys. Just don't edit it. Leave it for everyone so they can read it. But I'm happy to kind of share that. One kind of anecdotal point I do want to point on. We were talking with a couple, or I was told by Dr. T. She might have told you this as well, but she was talking with a bunch of program directors, and they were all like, one of them was like, if I have to read another story about how someone tore their ACL or tore their meniscus and that's what brought them into rehab, like I'm literally going to shoot myself because I guess a lot of people do it. Yes, it can have good intentions, but sometimes, in the grand scheme of things, an ACL or the meniscus is it's a lot different than a spinal cord injury or something like that. Now, once you read mine, and if we have some time at the end, you guys want to go through it, I can pull it up. I do talk about my brain injury, but kind of talking with Dr. T and a couple other of my advisors who read it, they both thought that, this was something for me that was life altering and totally changed my trajectory and really gave me focus and perspective on how I wanted to help patients as a future doctor in my career. So she was okay with me using that example, but I just caution you if kind of looking at the overall perspective of what you're trying to use. But in general, have a plan. Start by pulling them in. Talk about events that define your personal characteristics. So, what are your personal characteristics? One thing I did is I texted my five closest friends and I said, hey, what are three attributes that you think I am really strong in? Like, what are my three strengths? And then I asked for what are my three weaknesses as well. And that allowed me to really craft a personal statement that I thought was genuine and that I was ensuring what I thought was my success and my strength was also what others thought my strength was. And then for the weaknesses portion, a lot of them aligned, but it gave me also some points to talk about during interviews when you're always asked that what's your weakness question. And so that's kind of my tidbit there is that can be really helpful in crafting your personal statement, but also helping you during interviews. And then finally, you discussed what you wanted to discuss. You should finish strong. And the more eyes you have on your paper, the better. So send it to family, send it to friends, have them proofread it, have it all marked up in red or purple, whatever color pen you need. Print off copies, just revise it, revise it, refine it. Don't be afraid to start over if you don't like it. Eventually, it's going to kind of accumulate in what you want it to be, and that's going to be a good personal statement, and it's going to be genuine and reflect who you are as a person. And so finally, kind of moving into the interview shenanigans, just some things I want to touch on. A lot of this you probably already know, but there is some one interesting link that I'll talk about that I think, has some science back behind it. It's really goofy, but I used it throughout medical school before all my exams, before, step two, step one, before all my interviews. Whether it worked or not, who knows? But I do think it is um, pretty interesting. So, in terms of planning, interview prep's important. It gets really old. Uh, you can get really burnt out with all these virtual interviews. Maybe some of you might have in person. Traveling, takes a lot out of you. That can really be difficult. So, if you don't feel like prepping, prep. Just if you have who you're going to interview with, just like look them up, and that can formulate questions about maybe what research they're doing. If you run out of questions because you're going to get an interview season and literally you'll have 10 interviews or 5 interviews and every single one of them asks you like, do you have any questions for me? And you had like 4 or 5 stock questions that you wanted to ask about the programming clarification on. But then after like the fifth person doing that, you're like, what the fuck? I'm out of questions. And so it can be helpful to just have some specifics on who you're interviewing with. You can have specific questions to ask that person. Not necessarily, oh, like tell me about this research, but if it's something you're super interested in and relates to what you're doing, you can, tie it into you and them and kind of help establish that connection. So I think, that can be really important. In regards to all of this prep, like what is your brand? Like who are you? Why did you go into this field? What are you bringing to the program? Don't be ashamed to share that. You understand you're the person who knows you best. You have, gotten to the point you have earned this interview, you have been successful, you are successful. Show that. And don't be afraid to, talk about what you need and who you are. For me, I have really bad screen sensitivity. So looking at a computer screen was difficult. I have like a special paper screen that I look at. And so, I talked about, hey, like if I come to your program, is your program going to be able to buy me a monitor so that I don't have to pay $1,500 for this special monitor to leave at the hospital every day to use? And, I was a little worried that that was going to, hurt me, that people are going to be like, oh, like we don't want this person. But to me, that's what I needed to be successful. And yes, there's all of the, you can't discriminate against that stuff, which is a whole can of worms. But looking back on it, all the programs were, and you're going into a field that is all about, helping those who have disabilities. And so, I think if there's any fear from that regard, you should bring that up because I think it is important to advocate for yourself. Again, they are interviewing you, you are interviewing them. So I think that is a really important piece. Um, and I think another thing that I wish I did a little bit better job with is don't be afraid to evolve. So there's always going to be a better way to say something or a more eloquent way to say something. And I felt like after a couple interviews, I kept just find myself saying the same thing, like what my brand was. And it wasn't until like toward the end of interview season, I was like, oh, like I forgot about this experience. Like that actually applies a lot differently. I can like use that instead. So I kind of switched it up and talked about some of these other things. And whether that was good or bad, I don't know. But again, I got where I wanted to go. So maybe, it worked out. And then I think something that I bolded here, which I think is really important, is look at the interview planning dates. So a lot of the programs, some of them, or not a lot of them, but a good amount of them have Instagrams. A lot of them will post the days they will be having their interview days or the days they release whether you get an interview or not. Um, I I'm so glad I did this because I again was fortunate enough to get a good amount of interviews, but there was a lot of places that like overlapped, and there was a couple times where I got in situations like shoot, like I got to pick between these two programs. The only dates that are available when I got chosen to select to interview on through like the whatever that portal was, it was like, oh, I can only interview on this date and I already have an interview that day. So I guess I just can't interview with that program or I gotta like cancel my other interview. But was what was so helpful, like I picked like my top like five or six programs, and luckily all of them actually had the dates they were going to interview. And I tried to keep those days open for other interviews, hoping that I would get an interview with that program and be able to fill in one of those days. Unfortunately, it all worked out. Again, a couple I didn't get interviews from that I would have liked to, as I had some open dates, but I was, able to fill those in later. But, I think it was something that no one really talked about, but it was really helpful to try and set up certain times throughout the year for my interviews, knowing that a lot of the prelim TY interviews happened for me. Like they were offering like first thing really early in the year, like October, or even really just October, I guess. And then a lot of them were then later in the year, January, sometimes a couple were actually even in February. And so knowing that, you're able to kind of set up your timeline because nothing's worse than, I got that email like of a program that I like really was interested in, and I already had an interview that day. And I'm like, shoot, like what am I going to do? Like, can't, I guess I'm canceling my interview with this other place, which like, it's just kind of bad form. And luckily there's enough time ahead that you can just kind of say, hey, like, I'm sorry, I want to withdraw my nomination for this. Be respectful about it. Don't do it last minute. Make sure there's plenty of time ahead. If there's not time ahead, I guess if it's a program you really want to go to, uh, you cancel the one you already had, but know that PM&R is a really small world. So, people remember how they made you feel, not necessarily what you did. And if, you cancel on a program the night before an interview or two nights before an interview, and they don't have enough time to pick someone else for that, chances are, that name, like if your name comes across their desk again, they're going to remember, oh, this person literally like left us in the lurch and meant we couldn't interview some other deserving candidates. So definitely don't do that. And by planning out my interview dates, that was really, really helpful. I mentioned the PM&R Discord. I really didn't like to look on it, but for those of you who need to know everything, people would post like, oh, Harvard's releasing interviews, or oh, Michigan just sent out their final thing of interviews, or UPMC just released interviews, and you could then go rapidly like check your email and say, oh my God, did I get one or not? That wasn't about me. I tried to ignore that because it just made me way too stressed. But that can be kind of helpful for those of you who really want to know, and that might release some anxiety. For me, it was the opposite. During, biggest thing is don't be late. It seems stupid, but the amount, like, there was at least every other interview, someone was late. Maybe not every other. Maybe like every fifth interview, there was one person who was late. And it's like, come on, guys. Like, we're all professionals. How do you fuck this up? And inevitably, there's like Zoom issues or stuff like that. But there were so many times where it's like, oh, it was the wrong time zone. Or if you're doing like I did aways in a couple different time zones, like it being in Colorado and in Utah. And it's like, okay, did I set my time zone? Like, was it East Coast? And when I put it in my schedule, like technically I put it in for like 6 p.m. Mountain Time because it's like 4 p.m. East Coast time. But then I come back out East. I'm like, oh shoot, did it update? Did it not update? So just like make sure you know your time, that if you are going between time zones, if you're interviewing in a different time zone, it seems some seems silly, but like you'd be surprised how many people kind of mess that up. I mentioned, alluded to this before, ask questions, even if you don't have questions. I literally had one interview where I interviewed with four people. All of them asked me like, oh, what questions do you have? And then the fifth person I interviewed with, like the entire time was just, what questions do you have? And I was like, my man, I just got all my questions answered. How am I supposed to ask you questions for 20 minutes? So, but you have to fill that time. You don't want to be the person who's like, no, I don't really have any other questions. So, get to know the person you're interviewing with. Again, going back to prepping, figure out who you're interviewing with, come up with, intelligent questions, how to ask them, actually be interested in, and ask questions that are going to help you understand whether or not you're going to be a good fit for that program. And then I think on these virtual interviews, the downside of it being virtual is you don't actually get to meet in person your potential peers. And there were more than I would have thought. There was more social hours or more interviews where like no one was talking during the downtime. And it was like, this is like kind of awkward. And like, yes, sometimes you need time to go to the bathroom and things like that, but that's totally fine. But like, there'd be times where you're all logged in with the coordinator and just sitting there and everyone's just silent, like prepping. Like, I get you got to get in your own zone and like, do you to like do your pregame warm up. But at the same time, like, unmute and be like, hey, where are you guys calling in from? Like, how are you guys doing? Get to know those people because, there's one of my co-residents, Tosh, like, I interviewed like three or four places with him. I didn't talk to him once before. My thought of who he would be is like totally different than who he is. And I kind of wish I had like kind of got to know him during the interview trail because I think I would have had a different impression of him. But so I just put that out there that like be personable, get to know the people you're interviewing with, because there's a good chance you're going to see them on other interviews and you guys kind of connect with that. And so I kind of alluded to the beginning, but this power pose, this is something that's backed by research. I'll have Steven send out these slides or I'll share it. There's a YouTube video to it for a TED Talk. It's this researcher, Amy Cuddy, that talks about the power of body language and the idea that these power poses, so making yourself look big, so like, holding a Superman pose, your hands in your hips, and kind of speaking positive thoughts, uh, can really influence performance and influence performance even at the hormonal level. So it talks about your levels of cortisol and things like that in the video. So if you have some spare time or don't believe me or just are interested in learning a little bit more about that, I won't play it. It's like a 20-minute video, but it's kind of interesting. And I used it before all of my exams, and whether it helped or not, I don't know. But it's backed by science, so why not give it a go? And then in terms of post interview, send your thank you emails unless you're specifically told not to. One thing that I thought was kind of helpful, make them personal. So what I did is with each of my interviews, I just jotted down one or two things we talked about so that I wasn't like sending a generic interview like, oh, thanks for your time, really appreciate it. Be like, hey, like I really appreciated talking about spinal cord injury and hearing about how you manage your patients on the unit. Like, would love the opportunity to be a resident in your program and really learn from you. I thought, our time was amazing. Something like that to make it a little bit more personable so that they'll remember you because they're going to get hundreds of emails, thank emails. Honestly, they're probably not going to read them, but in the off chance they do, they might remember yours because it's a little bit more personal than something generic. And then in terms of letter of intent, I asked a lot of people. A lot of people have asked me from last cycle, like, what are your thoughts on a letter of intent? It's up to you. I honestly don't think it matters that much. But if you're gonna do it, only send one. Don't send a generic one to, three or four different places because the worst thing you want is to have two programs rank you to match, and you send a letter of intent to one program and you match at the other program, and then they're like, "What the fuck? You said you were my number one, and I obviously wasn't." And then all of a sudden you're at PM&R presenting a poster, and it's awkward. So just don't do that. Really, just send it to one program. Tell them why you want to go there, why you think you'd be a good fit, and don't expect an email back. I sent one to UPMC. Uh, I did get an email back, but it was very generic. So don't take that or take that as it is. It's not something that you really need to rely on. So that kind of wraps everything up. I want to open the floor to you guys. I know I just talked for a while, a little bit longer than I was hoping to, so I apologize. But what questions do you have? It can be, about anything I touched on, about applying what I talked about to your life. Like, again, it's a small group, so I'm happy to kind of talk about anything. I see a message in the chat about um, let's see, what are your thoughts on how many programs an applicant should apply to now that there are 20 signals? This is a good question, and I'm not going to pretend to say, oh, I'm an expert or something like that, because I think when I did it, we had 8 signals. So you really, no, not even, but 5 signals. And so you had to be really strategic about that. From what I've talked to amongst my fellow residents, and one attending who's not an APD or anything like that, but is slightly involved, like she does participate in interviews. I would say that with the increased signals, it's ultimately really just going to, if you didn't signal program, you're probably not going to get an interview, would be my guess, because I just don't, and my coworker or my co-residents agree that like it just like doesn't really seem feasible for at least the top programs to be like, oh, I'm going to give an interview to someone who didn't signal me because we get hundreds of applicants who signal us. So that just doesn't really make a lot of sense. So I think in that regard, it just you should be judicious of who you signal. Like maybe have some reach programs that maybe might just be a little bit out of your reach. Have a good chunk of programs where you feel like you're going to be competitive. And then, or I guess I would say probably the rest of where you feel like you're going to be competitive. And then you could maybe apply to some programs that might not be quite as good and not signal them um, because of you might still get an interview because they're not getting as many signals. That being said, like there's so many ways that I feel like people think they can cheat the system that at the end of the day, it ends up kind of all coming out in the wash. So, don't be, it kind of comes with the ranking as well. Like rank where you want to go, like signal where you want to go. Unless it's like totally out of your reach and you're like, yeah, like my test scores aren't great. I don't have the research, don't really have any connections. Like, why am I, applying to I don't know, Stanford when I have no connections to California, feel like I don't like vibe with any of the research or anything like that. So I think you just gotta kind of be judicious about that, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question? Another question here. Those are two. For MS1s, MS2s, what can you do right now to set yourself up for success for applications in the future? I think the biggest piece is take care of what's in your control. So really develop a strong knowledge base because yes, it's going to help you with your tests and your scores and your academics. But if you can really have a strong fundamental knowledge base, a strong clinical skill set, when you enter third year rotations, fourth year rotation, acting internships, things like that, it's what's going to kind of set you apart from everyone else. So it really helps you stand out. So that's one way to do it. The other thing to kind of focus on as well, and again, you can't always focus on everything, but volunteering about things you're passionate about and understanding that this whole medical journey is a process. That it's totally okay if you're like, I don't know if PM&R is for me, or you're like, I'm gung ho in PM&R, and then you do a surgery rotation. You're like, this is what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna do surgery. Like, it's okay. Like, I had research in like MS related stuff because I was like, oh, I was thinking like neurology or even like neurosurgery for a hot sec. I kind of also was like, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I was also like sports med ortho. That sounds sweet. And then I kind of had this brain injury and everything kind of got changed around, and everything that I had set up before that was now kind of like, oh, I'm totally switching gears. And I have peers who, you know, didn't know they wanted to go to PM&R honestly until fourth year. And they did a rotation in it and they switched. Like one of my friends who she matched at Stanford, she switched literally September or no, August. Yeah, August of fourth year. She was like gung ho on neurology. Like she was going neuro all the way, did her neuro rotation. She's like, holy shit, I hate this. And then she had a PM&R rotation afterwards. She did that. She's like, wow, like I actually really like this. I'm gonna do that. So she switched. She matched exactly where she wanted to go. So I think keep an open mind, focus on the things that are in your control, be willing to kind of go with the flow and volunteer for experiences, whether or not it is or isn't related to your area that you're interested in, because you never know. You might see something down the road that is of interest to you and helps guide what you ultimately do with your career. So another question here about elective rotations in PM&R. If this is your first time being exposed to the field, what are some things you can do now to kind of balance like your knowledge and on these rotations? I think I like to say that PM&R is kind of the bastard stepchild, excuse my language, of neurology and like sports medicine, like general, honestly moving a little bit more to internal medicine, just based on, at least here at UPMC, how medically complex these patients are. So a really strong clinical exam, a really good neuro exam can be really helpful in terms of um, impressing and standing out on PM&R rotations. One thing that I did that, looking back, it is a little bit more work, but I think it did help me stand out. And I didn't do it with every rotation, but I asked pretty much every attendant I worked with, like, do you have any studies or research articles that were really impactful in your education, your growth as a physiatrist? So, one thing was like, oh, like, yeah, this like article on how the like Rancho scale has been adjusted and how that kind of came to be. Um, I don't think you need to know the Rancho scale and all of its metrics and all of that going into your PM&R elective. I didn't know that, nor do I know it now. But knowing good physical exam skills, how to grade muscle strength, maybe knowing what spasticity is, like the definition of velocity dependent contraction and tone, and how to, like the modified Ashworth scale, just kind of being familiar with that. I think that can be helpful. But a lot of these attendings know this could be your first time getting PM&R exposure. And so it's okay to not know stuff. You're not going to be coming in day one and they're going to treat you like, say, someone from internal medicine or maybe an ICU rotation or a pulmonary or cardiology rotation where like they know you've done internal medicine. Like, so they can kind of ramp it up and expect you to know these things. That's not the case in PM&R. So I think the expectation's a little bit low. Maybe not expectations not lower. It's just a lower bar because we realize not a lot of people got exposure. There's really only a couple programs in the country that mandate medical students to do PM&R rotations. I think one of which is Northwestern. I think Pitt maybe makes you choose between one and PM&R and something else. But it's well known that like if you're doing an elective rotation, like it could be your first exposure to PM&R. Hopefully that answered your question.
Would you tell people to get PM&R recap Sam as a fourth year?
Uh, like the like question bank and info bank.
Like the book and the videos?
It might be helpful. I honestly don't have that much uh exposure to it. It's one of those things where like I'm gonna buy that this year to probably for my 3 years to study for boards and stuff like that. I don't think it's necessary, to be honest. I think you can save that money and, find either some online stuff. I think there's like an online PM&R Pockepedia. I might still have the link for it. If I do, I can send that. You can kind of read through some stuff like that. Um, has some like very generic stuff on like wheelchair fitting, prosthetics, orthotics. Like that's something I have like honestly no exposure to, but like I read a chapter on, how to set up a wheelchair and it was like about 1,000 feet over my head, but it's something that I'm going to have to take into account as a physiatrist when I, work with amputees or spinal cord injury patients, or during my prosthetics and orthotics rotation. So I think, it could be beneficial. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's going to make or break uh, whether or not, people love you or they don't love you. I don't think it's going to make that big of a difference. What other questions do people have? Be about anything, about third year, about interviews, about anything fourth year. Again, this time is for you guys. I want, to answer any questions you have. Hopefully, this kind of provided a perspective that maybe you hadn't thought of, and you can take any component of my talk and kind of implement it into what you need to do to be successful.
So I have one question for you. Unless I'm mistaken, you're a PGY2, correct?
Yes.
Is there anything you wish you would have done different during that, initial IM year to kind of help you better prepare for being a PGY2?
Um, Maybe. I think now, do I wish I spent more time studying PM&R specific stuff? Yes. But I think some of the advice I got from actually the current the actually the people who graduated last year or most recently, and then the current PGY4s, one of which being the chief, is you know your PM&R residency is going to train you to be a physiatrist, and part of being a good physiatrist is having a strong foundation in internal medicine. And especially, I've already, like, I just finished my medically complex service. So we were doing actually transplant patients and neuro patients here at Monty. And it was like so medicine heavy. Like we were titrating GDMT, we were, diuresing people, we were managing like transplant meds, granted with the help of transplant for some of the stuff because they kind of, are picky about their patients. But we had a lot of leeway in, the medical management. And so I'm grateful that, Jean-Luc and Phil had kind of said, hey, like when I asked them, like, should I like start prepping? Like, what should I start doing? They're like, no, like enjoy your intern year, focus on the medicine, try and learn it because, you do a lot more medicine. Granted, I will say, UPM, and part of the reason I chose UPMC is, they get a lot of very acute care patients because a lot of their inpatient units are associated with critical or both critical care and I guess acute care hospitals. They're not standalone rehabs. And so we can call rapid responses, we can call conditions on our unit, and a medical team will come and do it. Whereas some programs are at standalone hospitals where they have to send those patients out. So I'm glad I really tried to stay present and learn the medicine portion of it my first year because I think it has already helped me in terms of helping manage my patients now that I'm in rehab, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Any other questions? Happy to answer questions about Lankinoff. People are considering going there. My little blurb for them, cannot speak highly enough about it. There, I know they're not one of the programs that unionized in Philly because Philly had the big unionization push, but they did, I think, hook up the residents pretty well. Has great electives for PM&R. The schedule, the 28-hour call looks a little scary, but I promise you, it is like pretty sweet. So I'm happy to answer those questions either now or separately as well. Cool. Well, if there's no other questions, happy to answer anything else. I'll throw my email here in the chat. If anything else comes up or you have any other questions that you didn't want to um, ask or you think of later, feel free to email me. I'll try and get back to you as fast as I can. I am starting a new rotation, so who knows how it will be. But I'll do my best to get back to everyone if people do have questions.
Awesome, Sam. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. And best of luck for everyone. Like, for those of you who are fourth year, this is like kind of a stressful time. I get it. Enjoy it. It's gonna work out the way it works out. Uh, you're gonna get to a place where you're gonna learn a lot and become a great physiatrist. For those of you who are earlier on your education, good luck. It's hard, but I promise you it'll be worth it. Keep an open mind, just keep learning and have fun. Because ultimately, we're pretty lucky to be able to do what we do, and we're pretty lucky to be in the position that all you guys are in. So best of luck, guys.